Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your brain is playing tricks on you, especially as you get older? Well, this new study dives deep into why older adults might be more prone to false memories and what parts of the brain are involved. We all make memory mistakes sometimes, right? You're absolutely sure you locked the door, only to find out later you didn't. But for older adults, these kinds of memory errors can happen more often and sometimes have bigger consequences. Scientists want to know why, and crucially, if there are ways to protect against it. This study looked at the frontal lobe, a part of your brain known for decision making and memory monitoring. They wanted to see if different aspects of how the frontal lobe works could predict how likely older adults are to have false memories. Think of it as a big competition or a cage match, where they put different measures of frontal brain function head to see which one is the best predictor of false memories in older age. So, what did these researchers do? They gathered 71 older adults and put them through a series of tests. First, they had them do memory tasks designed to see if they'd falsely recognize things they hadn't actually seen, both for words that were semantically related and for images that looked similar to ones they had seen. While they were doing these memory tests, they were scanned with an fMRI machine to look at what was happening in their brains. On top of that, they also did some classic cognitive tests, like remembering sequences of numbers backwards, and had their brain structure scanned to measure things like how thick their brain's outer layer, the cortex, was. They wanted to see which of these many ways of measuring frontal brain function could best tell us who was more likely to experience false memories. Now, the researchers had a specific way they wanted to measure false memory to get the clearest picture. They called it the corrected false alarm rate. It's a clever way to try and separate a genuine false memory from just a general tendency to say yes to things. Essentially, they looked at how often people wrongly identified related items as something they'd seen, and then subtracted how often they wrongly identified completely unrelated items. This way, they hoped to isolate the false memory that comes from things being too similar. They did this for both the word memory task and the image memory task. And what did they find when they looked at this corrected measure of false memory? Well, it wasn't quite what they expected. When they put all 5 of their frontal lobe measures, neuropsychological tests, brain thickness, brain activity, and representational distinctiveness into the mix, none of them significantly predicted how likely someone was to have a corrected false memory. They ran statistical tests, and the numbers just didn't show a strong link. They even used something called Bayes factors, which are like a fancy way to compare how likely the data is under different scientific ideas. In this case, they compared a model with just basic demographic information like age and education to a model that also included all those frontal brain measures. For both the word and image memory tasks, the data were actually several times more likely under the simpler model that didn't include the frontal measures. This suggests strongly that these frontal factors, as measured in this specific way, weren't really adding anything to predicting corrected false memories in this group. Because the results for the corrected false alarm rate were so null, the researchers decided to do something a bit extra, something they hadn't planned beforehand. They looked at a simpler measure of false memory, just the raw rate of falsely recognizing related items without subtracting out the unrelated items. This is a more common way to measure false memory in many studies. And here, things got a little more interesting, at least for the word memory task. When they looked at the uncorrected false memory rate for words, adding the frontal measures did predict a significant amount of variance. The data were even more likely under the model that included these frontal factors compared to the one that just had demographics. Specifically, they found that higher brain activity in the frontal lobe during false memory trials was actually linked to lower rates of false memory for words. This is the opposite of what some previous research suggested, where more activation meant more false memory. For the image memory task, however, even with this uncorrected measure, the frontal factors didn't really add much predictive power. The model with just demographics was still favored. They also noticed some other interesting things when looking at the data. For instance, the older people were, the thinner their frontal lobe cortex tended to be, which aligns with other research. And as expected, people who were better at remembering number sequences backwards also tended to do better on another frontal function test. So their sample seemed to behave in ways that matched general knowledge about aging and the brain. Now, every study has its limits, and it's important to talk about them. One issue here was the reliability of the corrected false alarm rate, especially for the word memory task. This means the measure itself might not have been perfectly consistent, which could make it harder to find real relationships. Also, The difference between how often people mistakenly identified related words versus completely unrelated words was smaller for words than for images. This might have made the frontal lobe's job harder in the word task, maybe requiring more mental effort to tell the difference. So, what is the big takeaway from this cage match of frontal brain measures when they used the more precise corrected measure of false memory? Those frontal brain factors didn't predict who was more or less susceptible to false memories in older adults. This was a bit anticlimactic, especially given all the previous research suggesting a strong link. However, when they used a simpler measure, they did see some hints of a connection, though it was inconsistent across word and image memory tasks. What does this mean for us? It challenges the straightforward idea that having a better performing frontal lobe automatically protects you from false memories in older age, at least as measured by corrected false alarm rates. It might be that the brain's role in false memory is more complex, or that different measures capture different things. The fact that frontally mediated processes are so important for retrieval monitoring and metacognition, basically checking your work and knowing what you know, suggests the frontal lobe is involved. But maybe individual differences in these processes aren't the strongest predictors of false memory susceptibility in older adults. Or maybe the way we measure them isn't quite capturing the right thing. The study really highlights how important it is to be careful about how we measure false memory. Using the corrected versus uncorrected measures led to different conclusions, especially for the word task. This means researchers need to be clear about what they're measuring and consider reporting both simple and corrected measures to get a fuller picture. For older adults, especially where memory is so crucial for independence, understanding these nuances is key to developing effective interventions. The fact that some frontal measures did predict aspects of false memory when using the uncorrected rate, like the link between brain activity and false memory for words, suggests that the frontal lobe might still play a role, but perhaps a more nuanced one that depends on how we define and measure the problem. This is a really thought-provoking study because it pushes back against some long-held assumptions. It is great that they tested so many different ways of measuring frontal function within the same group of people, an approach that's sorely needed in memory research. The Bayesian analyses are particularly strong here, giving us more confidence that for the corrected false memory measure, there really isn't a strong link with these frontal factors in this sample. However, the exploratory findings for the uncorrected semantic lure false alarm rate are also important. The finding that greater frontal activation was linked to less false memory for words is really counterintuitive and contradicts some prior work. This might suggest that when people are actively processing information related to a false memory, it might actually help them avoid making the error, at least under certain conditions, or that the type of activation matters more than just the amount. Future research could really dig into this, maybe by looking at more specific patterns of brain activity, or using different types of memory tasks. The study also reminds us that aging itself is associated with changes in the brain, and these broader age-related changes might be overshadowing more specific links between individual frontal function measures and false memory. It is a complex puzzle, involving not just frontal lobe integrity, but also how different brain regions interact and how the brain compensates for age-related changes. Ultimately, this research is a great example of how a well-designed study can challenge existing ideas and open up new avenues of investigation. It tells us that protecting older adults from false memories might require a deeper understanding than simply looking at a few measures of frontal function. What do you all think about these findings? Do you find yourself making more false memories as you get older? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into the science of memory and aging, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.